Hello everyone, I'm Dave Thomas, and today I am building the Payload Altitude Rocket by Apogee Components. And as its name implies, this is meant for competition. It's sized so that it can accept a standard payload, and we're going to build this as if we're trying to get it to go as high as possible. So first of all, we'll go ahead and open up our instructions here and make sure there's nothing in them that we need for the rocket. Okay, and then let's just go through here. So we've got our main body tube here, and then we've got our payload tube. Okay, a set of fins and a standoff for the launch lug there. Okay, parachute kit, Kevlar shock cord, and we've got a coupler, and finally our nose cone, which is very lightweight. Alright, there's our launch lug and then an engine block. So it looks like we have everything we need here. Now, I just found one other piece that I had missed in the instructions, and that's this bulkhead. In my kit, it was stuffed up inside the coupler there, so be aware of that. So I'll clear off most of this and we will get started. So the first thing we're going to need to do is to separate these tubes here. Okay, so the main part will be our main body tube, and then the middle part there will be the altimeter bay, and then the ring there at the top will be the shoulder for the nose cone. Alright, and then to clean up the edges, I'm going to use a little bit of 220 grit sandpaper here. I'll just put that on the surface and we'll just lightly sand these in a circular motion. And this just removes a little bit of the cardboard that gets left there. Now, we're going to take the bulkhead here, this little guy right there, and take our Kevlar shock cord. Now, before I start working with this, I'm going to use a little bit of super glue to fuse the ends and keep them from fraying. So just put a little touch of super glue here, down below where the actual fray is. And then just take a tissue and just wipe off the excess. And then take your hobby knife then and cut off the frayed parts. Alright, so now we'll go ahead and extend this out. Okay, so we're going to pass this up through one of the little holes. And then back down through the other. Alright, and then we're going to tie. They just show a single half hitch on there. I'm going to tie a double knot or 2 half hitches. So I don't want this to come undone on me. Okay, so pull that tight. And then here I'm going to go ahead and add another little drop of super glue to this knot so that it does not come undone. And then also I've got some excess coming off of here. It's probably not going to be a problem, but just to be assured here, I'm just going to cut that back a little bit so it's not hanging over the bulkhead. Okay, and then we're going to take our red coupler here. We're going to string the shock cord through it. And then this is going to go right into the end like that. Okay, so from here we're going to need a little bit of wood glue or white glue. And this is going to go right along the edge here. Now you might get a little bit of glue on the shock cord. It's not a big deal. If it does happen to glue itself to the side, it'll pull itself free about the first time you use this. Alright, so I'm going to set that aside to dry. And then most likely I'll put a little bit more glue on there once this has taken hold. While we're waiting for the bulkhead glue to dry, we can go ahead and put in the thrust ring. Now, the instructions say this is optional, and what they're doing is if you don't put that in, you're still going to have some way of keeping the motor moving up through the tube. And so what they do is actually tape the motor on, because when you mount the motor in here, the fins only come down to this point, so you've got some space here, and they put the motor to about there and wrap masking tape around both the end of the body tube and the motor. Okay, that does save you a few fractions of a gram of weight from the thrust ring. The problem personally for me is that I would forget about it and end up not putting any tape on there and having my motor go up through the tube. Okay, now if you look carefully here, etched onto the tube are markings for the fins here. So I'm going to mark this aft on the inside to help remember that. Okay, now to help me get this up inside, I've got an engine spacer here. Now this does not come with the kit, but lots of other kits do, and I've got a whole box of these. If you don't have one of these, you can use a dowel or something like that. Okay, I have marked this already at 2 1/4 inches, which is what they recommend in the instructions, so right there. Alright, now I don't want to be pushing the ring through a big glob of glue that smears all the way up the tube, so instead I'm going to use a cotton applicator here and just get some glue on that. Okay, and then I'm going to use my spacer here and mark my thumbnail at my measurement. I'm going to slide this in and then move it around the edges, bring that back out. Okay, I'm going to put the little ring in there, slide it up until we get to my mark there, and bring that back out. Okay, so now that gets to dry as well, the tube. Okay, next we're going to do the nose cone here, since we're still waiting for other glue to dry. Now I normally use a plastic cement on this type of plastic, but it's so thin that it would melt. So instead we're going to use a little bit of super glue, and in the instructions they're just showing it as regular old super glue. And I am currently out of high viscosity super glue, so I'm going to go with this. So I'm just going to make a bead of glue right around the inside, just enough to cover it. Okay, then we're going to pop that in as so. Okay, and that can dry. Alright, you may have noticed here we're doing a lot of gluing and waiting. The original glue on my bulkhead is dry, and I just added a little bit more here to strengthen it a bit. But we're going to go ahead and move on to the next step. So I need to measure 1/2 inch from the bulkhead side there. So it'll be right here. And then this is going to go up into the payload bay, or the altimeter bay tube here. So I'm just going to do a quick dry fit. Okay, and it's actually a little bit wobbly there. And then this tube is going to go over it like that. Okay, so even though it's a little bit wobbly, that's the way it's supposed to go. So we will go ahead and glue this in. So we're going to put a bead of glue around here. Now in my case, since it is kind of wobbly in there, I'm going to give it a little extra glue. Alright, we're going to insert this up to our pencil line. I'm going to move it back and forth a bit there. And now I'm going to let that dry before we do anything else. Now when I said before I do anything else, I meant with the tube. We're going to go ahead and start work on the fin stock here. And so the instructions say to use some 200 grit sandpaper followed by 400 grit before we even take them out. So I've got 220 here, which is close enough. And we're going to sand these with the grain before we even take them out. Now this is fairly thin material, so do be careful as you're working with it. It's going to be easy to snap it if something gets snagged. Alright, and then I'm going to change to some 400 grit sandpaper. Right here. Now this is black because it's wet dry sandpaper instead of just dry sandpaper, but it works. Okay, now once you've got it sanded, take a hobby knife and gently cut these out. Should be just a little bit left there, just some little nubbins that are holding those on. Don't try and just force them through. These are just so thin you'll end up breaking one. And this, for this type of rocket, we're trading a lot of strength for being lightweight. And don't forget this little piece here. This is our standoff for the launch lug. Launch lug is actually optional, as many competition rockets will use some form of lugless launcher, either a piston launcher or a, oh, I forgot what you call it now. Basically, it just has 3 bars around it. Alright, now, initially we can stack all these together, and they are not quite symmetrical. So make sure you get them stacked together in such a way that they all match up there. And I'm going to come back to my 220 grit sandpaper, and now I'm just going to do all the edges, and this will remove those little nubs that were left from the cutting process, and this will also remove some of the soot here from where they were laser cut out. Okay. Now, as I've mentioned frequently in a lot of these things, what you do with your fins is often a trade-off between aerodynamics and strength. Now, as I said in the intro to this, I'm going to do this to try and get more altitude out of it. Okay, so I'm trying to decide which way their fins are actually going here. I think it's going to go like that, where we taper upward more than we taper downward here. So this will be the leading edge. And you can round these, or you can airfoil them, or you can taper them. And I'm going to take the option of tapering them all the way around. So here I'm going to take my 200 grit sandpaper again to start with. Okay, and what I'm going to do is just kind of taper the edges all the way around here so that we get a knife point when we're done. You want to make that angle fairly shallow. Now, this does have the disadvantage in that it's really one of the more difficult things to get even. Especially with elliptical fins. Okay, so check it in cross-section frequently. Look at where the taper's going. So I've got kind of a knife going here. It's not quite as knifey toward the root edge there. Now we're not tapering the root edge. That would just result in fins falling off. But everything else. That is surprisingly even. Alright, so I'm going to do the same thing now with the other fins. I'm going to do it off camera, and then I'll come back and we'll finish working on them. Here I have my fins all sanded, and the word or phrase I was looking for just before this was launch tower. Alright, so if you're using a launch tower or a piston launcher, you don't need the launch lug. I don't have either one of those, although some of the people I launch with do. But I'm going to go ahead and make this with the launch lug, so I will hang on to my little standoff there. We're going to add some sanding sealer here, and I'm going to use a polyurethane based one. Now, I got a whole quart can of it, and I think it's made by Minwax. That much sanding sealer will probably last me the next 10 years. And so what I've done is I take several of these little plastic jars and just put little aliquots in there, and that way I don't have to keep opening the can and shutting it and waiting for it to dry out. Also, if I spill it, this is a whole lot easier to clean up than if I take a whole can out. Okay, now what you're going to need here is a piece of corrugated cardboard, and it doesn't have to be like this. This is actually a cheap rocket stand my students build. But just, a small box edge, anything like that. And you're also going to want some straight pins. The narrower the better. Now these are dissection pins. You can just, you can use thin dressmaker's pins, whatever. And what we're going to do here is very carefully insert these off center into the root edge. They don't have to go very deep, and what you're making here is simply a handle, and do that for each one. And be careful you don't stick it into your finger or have it poke out the side. That's why I say you don't need to poke these in very far. You just increase the risk of a mishap if you do. Alright, and now you can use a paintbrush. I'm just going to use a cotton applicator here, whatever works for you, and we're just going to put a layer of the sanding sealer onto the fin here. Now try to keep it off the root edge. If you do get it on there, we'll sand it off later, but it just makes life easier. And so I'm kind of leaving just a barely, a 1 or 2 millimeter strip there along the root edge where I don't have that, and that gives me a better bonding surface for the glue later on. Do make sure you get it along the edges where we've just sanded, because this will harden at least a little bit the wood there, and that will strengthen it a bit. Because the danger is when you've got a knife edge like that, it chips really easily. And that's why I usually don't do that. Okay, so once you've got one of those on, then you just slide it into the perforation here to let it dry. Now this particular sanding sealer takes 1 to 2 hours to dry to the point where you can sand it. Okay, and then once you sand it, I'm using 400 grit sandpaper. Then you can decide whether or not you need more coats. So the more times that you coat it and sand it, the smoother the finish gets. However, it also makes it a little bit heavier. Okay, now as you put these on, do watch, a lot of times you'll get a drop forming at the lowest edge, and you can just take that off with your whatever you're using as an applicator here. Alright, so we'll let these set aside to dry as well. The altimeter bay here is now glued on, at least well enough that we can work with it. And so coming back to our instructions, we're going to insert it into the payload bay. Alright, so the etched line they're looking at here, it's very faint, but it's right here. Alright, and what we're going to do is glue this on where it's on that etched line, and we're going to have this matched up so that the holes here overlap the holes on the altimeter bay like that. Alright, so just as we did before, we'll use a little bit of white glue or wood glue here. Okay, and we're going to run a bead just inside here. Okay, then we're going to put this in, kind of rotating it back and forth as we go till we reach that line. Alright, and make sure we don't have any occlusions. Those are all good. Okay, and once more we wait for glue to dry. While I continue to wait for glue to dry, I'm going to go ahead and assemble the parachute here. So first of all, we need to take this string. This is actually Kevlar string. Alright, and we need to cut it into 3 equal pieces. So the way to do that, alright, is you take one end in each hand, and you got 2 hands that you make, or 2 fingers here that we're going to make into hooks. Alright, so you hook each side of that, pull it apart, okay, and now over here on one end, we've got a loop and an end, and we can just cut those off. Ah, now it's Kevlar, scissors aren't going to work. Okay, use a hobby knife instead. Cut those off. Okay, now I'm going to bring those through my fingers. And up again here. And that one we can just cut the loop right there. So now we have 3 equal pieces of Kevlar thread. Alright, go ahead and open up the sheet here. Okay, and we're going to take these little reinforcements and we're going to stick them at each corner. Now, using the end of a pencil or a pen, we're going to poke holes through these. You don't want to use a knife for this because it'll slice through the reinforcements. Okay, instead we're going to poke through the back side, just like that. You're going to have kind of a ragged hole there, but that gives more material to tie onto. So just do this all the way around. Now in the instructions it shows tying one string across and the other 2 like this. And that, if you've looked at Estes parachutes that are pre-made, that's how they're strung. The problem is this distance is not the same as this distance, and if you do it with equally sized strings here, you're going to get a weird parachute. It's not going to be symmetrical. Actually, it'll be bilaterally symmetrical, but you want it to be completely symmetrical. So, you can either tie it between corners, adjacent corners, or you can tie it between opposite corners. Okay. I find it's easiest to do adjacent corners. So here I'm just going to push my thread through my hole and tie it on with a double knot. Now the trick here is to try and use the same amount of thread in each knot all the way around. That's going to give you the best symmetry. Okay, and just cinch that down and then come to the adjacent corner and do the same thing. Okay, so that's one loop, and I'm just going to continue doing that with the other 2 strings here. So now we've got 3 loops here. Alright, now when we get to the point where we have the shock cord added, then we will tie this onto the shock cord. Now, I'm sure any of you who have watched my other videos are thinking, well, why not the snap swivel, Dave? You always put a snap swivel and everything else. For this type of a rocket, where it's a competition rocket, the snap swivel does add a significant amount of weight. And so I will just tie this directly to the shock cord as shown in the instructions when we get to that point. The first coat of sanding sealer is dry on the fins, And you want to check, sometimes you get little globs where it drip down, and you can just kind of shave those off with your hobby knife. And this will make sanding easier, because having that much stuff in your sandpaper is going to clog it up really quickly. Just be careful that you don't cut the wood. Alright, if you're not sure you're cutting the wood, just go ahead and sand it. Ooh. Okay, so there's a problem. Alright, and this is again something that with these thin fins is not too surprising. I'm going to need to fix that. And I think I'm going to use a little bit of super glue and see how that works. You could also use wood glue here. Since it's such a tiny piece, I'm hoping we can just stick that on like that. Okay, and I can let that dry on the same corrugated cardboard. Okay. Now, I hadn't planned on doing that, but it does show what can happen when you're working with these really lightweight fins. Okay, so to sand these, I'm going to use my 400 grit sandpaper again here, and we're just going to sand along the grain. And most of this should sand off. The idea here is that the only stuff that should remain is down in the grain of the wood. So we shouldn't have a lot of shininess here. Alright, now don't forget you'll need to touch up the edges here, because they had the stuff on it as well. Alright, I'm kind of sanding off where that blob of sanding sealer was there. Okay, and just do the other side as well. Alright, here's where we had another little blob of sanding sealer. Now, to avoid blobs of sanding sealer, don't use quite as much. And that can sometimes be hard to gauge because different lots of balsa wood are going to have different porosities. Okay, so when you're done here, you shouldn't see a lot of gloss. There's still some on there. It should you should see a little bit of glossiness in the wood grain. And the rest should be sanded away. Now, if you did happen to get some sanding sealer on the root edge, make sure you sand that off. I don't think I got any on that. Alright, but that's how it should look. And generally you're going to want at least 2 coats of the sanding sealer on here. So when I'm done sanding, I'll just go ahead and put my pin back in here. And it'll be ready for the second coat. Now, wait for this fin that needed repair to dry fully before sanding it, and I'll sand the rest of these off camera. While I'm waiting for the second coat of sanding sealer to dry on the fins, I've prepped this for painting, and so I've got a little wad of tissue here, But underneath that, I've got the shock cord wound up tightly and stuffed down inside there. And I masked off the coupler. And what I want is to have the upper part of the rocket a different color than the lower part, if for nothing else because it makes it easier to see whether or not it has ejected. So it's easier to see two pieces if you're, for example, if your parachute did not open or you lost it. Okay. Now to save weight, I'm just going to use a spray paint that includes its own primer rather than putting a layer of primer on and then the paint. Someone could actually do a study on that and see if having the primer that fills in the grooves and such here gives you is worth the trade-off in paint weight. I'm sure someone must have done it somewhere. All right, if not, there's a good project for you. Okay, so I'm going to take this off camera, paint these, and then come back. Something else I can do while I'm waiting for the sanding sealer to dry is I am going to use a launch lug on this, so I'm going to mark a line for it. And first I'm just going to eyeball here an approximately half distance between those two fin marks. All right, that's actually pretty darn close. And then I'm going to take my tube marking guide and put a line all the way down. Okay, so here, if you don't have a tube marking guide, you can use a door frame or a drawer edge. I find this thing really handy. Okay, so I just got a line all the way down, and even though the launch lug is only going to be at one end, having that long line is useful for sighting it so that you know whether or not it's straight. Okay, now the actual launch lug is going to go toward the forward end of the rear tube there, in fact right at it. Okay, so our launch lug right here, all right, is going to go, let's make sure we got the right end. Yep, it's going to go up here like that, but it'll be on this little standoff. And I'll put those on at the same time that I put the fins on. We are finally ready to put on the fins. Now here I have given these fins a second coat of sanding sealer and sanded them with 400 grit sandpaper again. And these are ready to go on. And so recall on our tube here that we've got laser etched fin guides there. And the rear of the fin should be at this little cross mark here. So we actually have some space on the body tube there. Now to attach these, we want to use some white glue or wood glue. And we want to give just a really thin film of glue here. We don't want a lot. Okay, so just kind of spread that evenly across. Now the flatter side here is going to face forward. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just place this against the line. Okay, and I'm going to let a little glue trail go there. And now I'm going to let these dry for 30 to 60 seconds and then come back and we'll put it back on. About 30 seconds have passed, and so now I'm going to put this right back on where it was. And in those 30 seconds, the glue has dried just a little bit and gotten tacky. And so this allows it to stand on its own here. And so we want to make sure it's perpendicular to the tube and in line and straight there. Now if you want, you can use a fin alignment guide like this one. This is a 3D printed one. Apogee also makes them made out of cardboard. But you can slide this down here, and that will help ensure that your fins are straight and evenly spaced. So it's good to let this first fin dry about 10 minutes, especially if you're not using a fin alignment guide. And then we'll go on and do the other two fins in the same manner. I will do that off camera. I have all three fins attached, though the glue is still drying. Now note I reversed the direction of my fin alignment guide, and that's so we can go ahead and work on the launch lug. If you have it going the other way, then you need to wait on the launch lug. So if you're using a fin alignment guide of any sort, make sure you don't glue it in. So that, you know, if I had this going the other way and I put the launch lug on, there was no way to get it off. So for my launch lug, I'm first going to put on the standoff here. And it's got just a little bit of remaining nub there from cutting it out. So I'm just going to give it a quick stroke over some sandpaper on each edge. Okay, it's not very big, so don't sand it too much. Alright, and I'm going to attach that up here on my launch lug line. Now if you want here, you can scrape this with just a little bit of sandpaper to remove the shiny finish. You can do that with the fins as well. I did not here, mainly because I forgot. But you can do that. Sometimes it gives you a little bit better hold. Okay, now just like the fins, I'm just going to put a light coating on here. So we don't want it dripping. And that's going to go right up here to the edge. Now, even though I'm only using this part of the tube, I made a line all the way down purposely to help me align this. So it gives me a sighting line. And you can just sight down this kind of like a gun sight. All right, make sure that it's perpendicular to the tube. Alright, and going straight in line. Okay, I'm going to let that dry about 10 minutes as well, and then I'll come back and put the launch lug on the other edge there. The glue on the standoff and fins has dried, and so now I'm going to add the launch lug. And this pretty much is going to go in the same way as everything else. We're going to use a thin layer of glue here. Put this right on top of it. Now here we want to make sure it's straight, perpendicular, and not rolled to one side. All of my glue has dried, so now I'm going to go ahead and add some fillets here to the fins and to the launch lug. Now the fillets are going to strengthen the fins and launch lug here, and they also increase the airflow around them, giving it better aerodynamics. But at the same time, they add weight. Now, I have never competed using these types of rockets, so if someone watching has information on where the break point might be between how thick you get your fillets and how much the aerodynamics pay off versus the weight, I'd like to hear it, and please leave a comment. Okay, so here I'm using an applicator simply because my finger won't fit in there. Alright, and I'm going to do the same thing for the fins, and they should be able to be fingered in there as one usually does. Okay, I like to do two facing fins at a time. Let me just get a couple of tissues ready here. Alright, and I'm just going to smooth those in. If you do want to go for thicker fillets, don't try and do it all at once. Give yourself some initial thin fillets, and then if you want to make them thicker. This is also why I tried to keep the sanding sealer away from it. So you can see in here I left a little bare spot along the edge, and that's to give the glue a better hold. Now if you happen to get more in, the sanding sealer over that area, it's not a big deal. Okay, and I'm going to let this dry horizontally so the glue doesn't run to one end or the other. And we're just going to let that fully dry there before we go on to other things. Now, while I was working on the fins, I was also working on the paint for the upper part of the rocket. So I painted the payloads and altimeter section here gloss black, and the nose cone is red, and probably I'll paint the main part of the rocket red as well. Here my fillets have dried, and I don't see any problems with them. There aren't any bubbles or lumps or anything. And so this is ready to be painted. Like I did with the rest of the rocket, I'm just going to use a paint that includes primer in it, and just use 2 coats here to save paint weight. Here's the bottom part of the rocket, and this has had 2 coats of red paint that includes primer. Alright, and it looks pretty good. And now you can see a little bit of wood grain here, and again, this is going to be a trade-off. Do you want to fill that in some more, but add weight, or leave it alone and save a little bit of weight? I'm going to leave it alone for this one, and once this dries, we'll be able to put together the rocket and be ready to go. The paint on the main part of the body is dry enough to handle, and so now we're going to put the whole thing together. And the last gluing step we have here is to install the shock cord. Now I'm a little bit leery of this. This is an Estes style shock cord now that you just fold and glue the shock cord into. I have tried this using Kevlar before, and it tends to rip through it. But we'll go with this and see what happens. Okay, so now we're going to need the shock cord out of the upper part. Got a little dusty there. Alright, carefully unwind this again. Okay, and put this down so I don't glue my work surface. Alright, so if you've built Estes rockets before, you've probably encountered these. So we're going to first of all just take and run a fairly heavy bead of glue down here. Okay, we're going to put the shock cord into the glue. I'm going to pull that up a bit. So it should be in the upper 2 regions there. And I'm going to just spread this glue all over. Okay, and I'm going to fold the first flap over and onto the middle one. Alright, you want to squeeze any air out of there, because what we want is a nice laminate of glue and paper and shock cord without air bubbles in it. Okay, now we're going to do this again, and I'm going to move it slightly so that the shock cord is not resting directly on itself, but is instead beside itself. Okay, we're going to pick that up. We're going to put a curvature into this so that it fits the body tube better. And then we're going to add some more glue. Okay, smear that around. Okay, now this needs to go at least 1.5 inches down inside. The farther you can get it, the better. And if you have an assistant with really long fingers, skinny fingers, this is the time to get them. I've got not so long fat fingers. Okay, and I'm pressing this against my hand and against the inside of the body tube. Now, if you need to, you can also use a dowel or a tool handle. You want to get that as flat as you can get it. Okay, we'll let this dry for a few minutes, and then we will put it all together. So here's our parachute. Alright, so we're going to gather the shroud lines together here. So you got 3 loops on your finger. And then hold this in approximately the middle of the parachute sheet. And then you can move things back and forth a little bit until those are as close to even as you can get it. Alright, now holding those loops, okay, we're going to put this through like this. Alright, we're going to open this up and we're going to pass the parachute through. Now unfortunately this is a place where we can get the shroud lines uneven again. Alright, but here I'm just going to pull those taut again and then together. Alright, make sure that's where it should be. That still looks good there. And we're going to add just a little tiny drop of glue there to keep that knot from coming undone. Okay, now if you've seen my other videos, you might be asking yourself, why isn't Dave using a snap swivel here? And it's because of weight. Okay, I'm building this to conserve weight, and so in this case we won't do that. Now when we're all ready to go, alright, the motor is going to go back here, and as I mentioned, there's no motor retention here. You can either put some masking tape around the motor and friction fit it in, or you can take and put the motor in like this and wrap masking tape around the outside, covering both the lower end of the body tube and the motor there. Alright, up on this end, you would put in 1 or 2 squares of recovery wadding, and then we'll take the shock cord here, and it goes down inside next. Give yourself a little bit of slack so you can work with the parachute. Okay, that goes down in there. Theoretically, you could also put the shock cord up here against the coupler. So if you find things are getting a little bit too packed, that's an option. All right, now to fold the parachute, I'm folding it in half first so that each corner is over another. And then I'm going to fold the corners over each other. So that now we've got a triangular shape here. Alright, and then we're going to take the shroud lines at about the halfway point, loop those up onto the parachute, and then fold the edges over. Alright, so we just got that little loop of the shock cord hanging out. I'm going to fold this down and then just kind of roll the edges over to form a cylinder-ish type thing. Alright, this is going to get stuffed down inside. And again, things may get a little crowded in there, and if they do, you can put the shock cord up in the top and then put just the parachute down in the main body tube there. Okay, and we just got to tuck all the rest of the shock cord wherever it'll go. Okay, now make sure it doesn't get between the body tube and the coupler there. Alright, so that should fit down like that. Give it a shake here. Alright, now it feels like it's about to come off, but I think it's going to be okay. If it just pops off really readily, put a little bit of masking tape on there. Now you're not taping it to the rocket. Okay, you want this just on the coupler. And you don't necessarily have to wrap the entire thing. With mine, it feels like that's just going to be enough. Okay, that gives us a little friction, but I can still pull it out easily. Alright, same thing with the nose cone here. Alright, so you got to put your altimeter in there, and you got to put your competition payload, and then this fits on like that. Okay, now this you want to fit really tightly. So if this is loose at all, you're going to want to put some masking tape here. You could even, for competition purposes, put some clear tape around this. Now, I don't like doing that, but if that's the way that you win your competition, go for it. Okay. Normally, in most payloaders, I would drill a hole through this and put a plastic rivet in there. But again, that would disrupt airflow a little bit and could interfere with your winning entry here. Alright, there are no decals or anything for this, so you can decorate it the way you want it. But that is my Payload Altitude Rocket. Alright, not a snappy name, but it describes it perfectly. I hope you had fun building this with me. Have a great flight and a safe recovery, and please stay tuned for more of my videos.